Let's wrap up with additional topics on step 5 of the model, recognizing revenue when or as performance obligations are satisfied. By this point, we will have identified a contract and its performance obligations. We will have determined its transaction price and allocated it to those obligations. Now the final question is, when do we actually get to recognize revenue? The general answer is that revenue is recognized when control of the good or service transfers to the customer. But some transactions are inherently more complicated. In this video, we're going to go over the following types of common arrangements that have important timing considerations. And the common theme here is control. Has the customer actually received control over what was promised? Or is the seller still holding on to an important part of the performance obligation? Let's start with licenses. A license gives a customer access to the seller's intellectual property, or IP. This could include a variety of things like software, trademarks, patents, copyrighted material, and so forth. ASC 606 distinguishes between two broad types of licenses. We'll start with functional IP, which has significant standalone value. In other words, the customer can benefit from the IP as it exists at the time the license is granted. A good example of this would be a pharmaceutical like Pfizer licensing a patented drug formula to another company. Importantly, once the licensee receives the right to use the formula, it can benefit immediately and start making knockoff versions of a drug. In this case, Pfizer would recognize all the revenue for the contract at a single point in time, as of the date the license is granted. Symbolic IP is different. It does not provide the same kind of standalone functionality. Its value often depends on the seller's ongoing activities to maintain a brand name, team logo, or character image. We usually refer to symbolic IP as providing a right of access. The customer is not just receiving something that has fixed value on day one. It depends on the seller continuing to support, maintain, or promote some symbolic image. A hypothetical here would be Disney licensing Marvel branding, characters, and artwork to Hasbro to create a Marvel-themed Monopoly game. In that case, Hasbro's not just benefiting from a static design file or a one-time transfer of artwork. The value of the Marvel brand depends heavily on Disney's ongoing activities, including maintaining the Marvel Universe, protecting the brand, and keeping fans engaged. That means the customer, Hasbro, is receiving a right to access Disney's symbolic IP over the license period. And because the customer benefits from Disney's ongoing support and development, revenue is generally recognized over time. So the intuition is this: if the customer is getting something they can use as is, that points toward recognizing revenue at a single point in time. However, if the customer is getting access to something whose value depends on the seller's ongoing efforts, that points towards recognition over time. Next, let's talk about bill and hold arrangements. A bill and hold arrangement exists when a customer purchases goods but asks the seller to retain physical possession of those goods until a later date. At first, this can feel a little suspicious from a rev rec perspective. If the seller still has the goods, has the customer really obtained control? And the answer is maybe, but only if certain conditions are met. Revenue can be recognized in a bill and hold arrangement only when the customer controls the goods, even though the seller is still physically holding them. There also needs to be a substantive business reason for the arrangement. For example, maybe the customer purchased the goods but does not yet have the warehouse space available. Or maybe the customer asked the seller to hold the goods until some scheduled delivery date that makes sense for them. The goods also need to be separately identified as belonging to that specific customer and be ready for shipment. The seller cannot use them to fulfill other orders, and the seller cannot have the ability to redirect them to another customer. So a key takeaway here is that physical possession and control are not always the same thing. And we'll see that same principle manifest, but conversely with consignment operations. In a consignment arrangement, the consignor physically transfers goods to a company called the consignee. The consignee then tries to sell the goods to an end customer. When they find a buyer, the consignee sends the sales proceeds to the consignor, usually after subtracting a commission and any other agreed upon expenses. If they can't find a buyer within the agreed period, the goods are simply returned to the consignor. And because the consignor retains the risk of ownership, they have not yet transferred control. And that means the consignor does not recognize revenue when the goods are shipped to the consignee. Revenue is recognized only when the goods are finally sold to the end customer. Next, let's talk about gift cards. And to be clear, I'm talking about when a company sells gift cards for its own goods or services. And there are a lot of advantages to this business tactic. One of them is that cash is received up front, but the company simply has not yet provided the goods or services. So consequently, the initial sale of gift cards is not revenue. Instead, the company records a liability, usually a deferred or unearned revenue, and that liability represents the company's obligation to provide goods or services in the future when the customer actually redeems the card. So again, revenue is primarily recognized when the gift card is redeemed. That said, sometimes gift cards can expire depending on applicable laws and company policy. When the obligation legally expires, the company can then recognize revenue because it no longer has to provide those goods or services. There's also the issue of breakage, which refers to the portion of gift cards that customers are not expected to redeem. If the likelihood of redemption becomes remote, the company may recognize revenue for that unused portion. Finally, let's consider franchises. In a franchise arrangement, the franchisor grants the franchisee the right to sell the franchisor's products, use their name, brand, processes, and perhaps other intellectual property. These arrangements often include multiple performance obligations. For example, the franchisor may provide an initial license to use the brand. It may help with site selection, training, store setup, marketing, or initial product supply. It may also provide ongoing support, advertising, quality control, like I say, a variety of services. And because of this, franchise RevRec often requires careful analysis. So stepping back, the big takeaway is that companies can earn revenue in many different ways, and understanding these is why Step 5 matters so much. Accountants need to understand the substance of the arrangement, not just when cash is received or whether an invoice was sent. The broader lesson here is that RevRec requires both structure as well as judgment. And I hope you recognize that you've taken some serious steps toward developing expertise in this topic.